Without any further ado, I will get us started. Welcome to our bi-monthly Bridge Book Club. Today we are discussing Arc of Justice, a saga of race, civil rights, and murder in the Jazz Age by Dr. Kevin Boyle. My name is Amber DeLinde. I'm the membership director at Bridge, Michigan. Many of you are likely very familiar with Bridge, but just in case you're not and you heard about this event from somewhere else, Bridge is a nonprofit, nonpartisan Michigan news source. You can find all of our content at bridgemi.com. We write about all things that are important in Michigan. We write a lot of policy, we do news and analysis, we talk about the most important things happening in our state. And at the beginning of this pandemic, we were looking for ways to connect with Bridge readers since we couldn't connect in person. And we decided that a book club might be something that would work really well. This is our second one, and we host these bi-monthly. The focus of these book clubs is always a book that has a connection to the state of Michigan, whether the author is from Michigan originally, or the subject matter is focused on Michigan, or it's set in the state of Michigan, and Arc of Justice fulfills a few of those criteria. I did want to mention that we do have a sister newsroom, which is called Bridge Detroit. So if you are interested in issues related to the city of Detroit, which you may be since you chose to read Arc of Justice, you may not be aware that Bridge Detroit is around and writes about community-focused news and events that are happening in the state of, in the city of Detroit. And you can check their newsroom out at bridgedetroit.com, and you can sign up for their free email newsletters there if you are interested in learning a little bit more about Bridge Detroit. But let me get our program started for today. Today we are so honored to be joined by author Kevin Boyle and by Daniel Baxter, who is Wayne County's Director of External Affairs, who grew up in the East Side Detroit bungalow where the events of this book transpired. We're just really honored that these two special guests have taken time out of their busy schedules to talk with us today. The schedule for today's discussion is that first we'll begin with a discussion with Dr. Boyle, and then my colleague, Bridge Managing Editor Joel Kurth, will talk to Mr. Baxter about the home and about his efforts to spearhead its restoration and turn the home into a museum. We'll then conclude today's program with questions from you, the readers, for both Kevin and Daniel. So like I mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions that you know you want to ask throughout this discussion, you can type those into the chat window on Zoom, or if you're on the phone, you can email them to me at DeLinde, DeLind, at bridgemi.com. My colleague, Catherine Dugal, is the Center for Michigan's Engagement and Development Specialist, and she is running the show today. She's collecting all of these questions and sending them to me, electronically so that I can monitor them and ask them at the end of today's discussion. You may know by now that we're recording the discussion and we'll be posting that recording tomorrow in Bridge. So if you know anyone who wanted to watch today but wasn't able to join us, you can send them that link tomorrow. That is all of my housekeeping. So without any further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Kevin Boyle. Kevin Boyle is a historian of the 20th century United States with a particular interest in modern American social movements. He is currently the William Smith Mason Professor of American History at Northwestern University. His publications include the UAW and the Heyday of American Liberalism, 1945 to 1968, Muddy Boots and Ragged Aprons, Images of Working Class Detroit, 1900 to 1930, Organized Labor in American Politics, 1894 to 1994, and of course, Arc of Justice, which received the National Book Award for Nonfiction, the Chicago Tribune's Heartland Prize, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Tolerance Book Award. It was the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and was selected for community-wide reading programs in the Detroit metropolitan area and the state of Michigan, much like this one. So without any further ado, welcome, Dr. Boyle. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Amber, for having me, and for Bridge for having me, and for all of you for coming in. And I just want to say how honored I am to be here with Daniel as well. It's really terrific to get to share this event with him. And I just want to thank all of you for coming as well. I suspect that 3 or 4 months ago, none of you would be the experts on Zoom that we've all become now.
That's for sure. That's for sure. I think every member of my family knows how to use it. now, and that is truly a miracle.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that, because now I'm going to mess it up sometime in the next hour.
No way, no way. All right. Well, Dr. Boyle, my first question that I have for you is a bit of a heavy one, but it was just so striking to me as I read Arc of Justice that here we are nearly 100 years after Dr. Sweet's trial, and so many of the central themes of this story, racial injustice, police brutality, rising nationalism, health disparities along racial lines, segregation, are still so present in today's America. What parallels do you see between the Jazz Age and today, and what do you think we might be able to learn from that time that could help us face these challenges?
I think for me, the most important thing that the parallels really suggest is, well, two things really. I think how deeply ingrained the racial system in the United States is, and how long a struggle it has been for African Americans against that system. You know, we have a really standard story, and a lot of us have, of the American Civil Rights Movement. You know, and it runs about 15 years. It runs from Rosa Parks through, say, Dr. King's murder in 1968. And if we think of that as the movement, then what the underlying message is that those structures of race and racism in the United States could be broken quickly. And I think what I like to think this story reminds us is how long a struggle this has been and how far we have to go. Because a lot of what, as you said, Amber, a lot of what happened on Garland Avenue, we see again and again in various forms almost a century later.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you for that sort of introduction to some of these themes that were so present in Arc of Justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your research, and how growing up in Detroit shaped your worldview and your approach to the book?
Sure. So I was born and raised on the east side of Detroit, and I grew up on the east side, well, my entire childhood actually, in the same house on the east side. And this was in the 1960s and 1970s. And it was a period of such intense racial conflict and in the city and in the country. And one huge portion of that, and I guess this kind of comes back to your last question too, one huge piece of that until really recently we haven't talked about, is the segregation of housing, the segregation of neighborhoods in the United States. Though in a lot of ways is the most enduring form of segregation in the American experience. You know, we're still, hardly a surprise to say this, but we are still overwhelmingly a segregated society. And through that period, growing up in that period, seeing the kind of immediacy of race in a way that I suspect, 15, 16, 17-year-olds are now seeing again, on the white side, of course, of the color line, really was a defining experience for me. It shaped how I saw the world. And so when I thought about writing a book about the civil rights movement, I couldn't see writing a book about the South. There are a lot of great books about the South and the civil rights movement, and I had nothing to add to them. What I thought we needed to see was the origins of this incredibly persistent system of racial segregation in American neighborhoods. And the North is more segregated than the South when it comes to neighborhoods. It always was, and it is to this day. The most segregated cities in America are all northern cities. And that was true in the 1920s, and it is true to this day. It's not to say there isn't segregation in the South, obviously there is, but Atlanta is less racially segregated than Detroit.
Wow.
Houston is less racially segregated than Milwaukee or Chicago or New York. And I wanted to say, where did that come from? Where did was that system created? And to say that from the start, African Americans fought against that system. And that was happening on Garland Avenue in this very complicated way but that's what was happening. This was a civil rights struggle in 1925 Detroit against what turned out to be the most enduring form of segregation in the United States. And from that system of segregation then comes all sorts of other systems of segregation that are fused from the segregation of social space, of where people live.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That kind of, it brings me to another question that I thought of while I was reading Arc of Justice. Do readers' reactions to the story of Dr. Sweet surprise you? I mean, I read an interview with you where you said that you had always known Dr. Sweet's story, having grown up in Detroit. And as a person who's lived in Michigan my whole life, I was embarrassed to say that I had never heard of this event before I read Arc of Justice, and I didn't know about the rise of the KKK in 1920s and in the 1920s in the northern cities. Several members of our book club said the same thing in our closed Facebook group. Why do you think this isn't more known amongst in kind of the outstate areas of Michigan?
Well, I should say that, I didn't know 350 pages of the Ocean Sweet story. I knew, that something had happened, that Clarence Darrow showed up, that it happened on the East Side. That was kind of the depth of my knowledge about the whole thing. So I'm not trying to claim that I knew all the stuff that ended up in the book. A lot of the stuff that ended up in the book really surprised me when I learned it. I think there's a lot of reasons I think that folks don't know this story, but a lot of it kind of comes back to what I was saying a minute ago, that what happens in the way people kind of imagine, and I should say, I'm really talking about white people here, the way white people imagine the world, the way they learned their history of race in America, is we've come to define so much, until recently really, we've defined so much of what racism and segregation is Southern. Mm-hmm. We think of what happens, segregation is having to sit in the back of the bus. Segregation is drinking from a separate drinking fountain. And none of those things happened by law in the city of Detroit or in Chicago or New York or Pittsburgh or Cleveland. It didn't happen. And so what that kind of perception does is it blocks out for people all the other stuff that defines segregation. The segregation of neighborhoods. And to this day, when I've gone to white groups and talked about the book, what people will say to me regularly is they will say, yeah, neighborhoods were segregated, but that was the past. Mm. And it was just choice. It was just a matter of choice. As if it isn't a structure, as if it isn't a system. But of course it is. It's not simply a matter of choice. It's tied to massive forces of the real estate marketplace. It's tied to deep racism. It's as structural a force as the law that said you had to drink from a separate drinking fountain. And yet, an awful lot of white Americans don't perceive that as the same thing, mm-hmm. as a different manifestation of the same structures and the same dynamics. So I think that's part of it.
Sure.
And then I think on a really immediate level, what makes the story, what happened on Garland Avenue happened in Detroit all the time for decades and decades. African Americans had moved into a white neighborhood, there'd be mob violence. The only real difference to all of these stories that happened in Detroit is that somebody got killed, that was unusual, and Clarence Darrow showed up.
Sure.
And Clarence Darrow showing up, I think, is one of the reasons, oddly enough, that this becomes obscured, because it's the next case he takes after the Scopes Monkey trial. Mm-hmm. And the Scopes Monkey trial is so famous and so iconic, and it's got Inherit the Wind, and it's in every textbook, that it kind of overshadowed the Sweet case. He didn't think of it that way. He thought of this as one of his great cases. But I think it did get kind of overshadowed in that regard. But the more important thing is it's how we perceive our past. If we think the only thing that is segregation is what happened in the South, then we don't see what's happening literally next door.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, as I was reading Arc of Justice, I knew this was a nonfiction text, but it also, to me, it reads like literature. It's just so engaging. Can you tell us a little bit about your choices to use kind of literary methods like flashbacks, character development, foreshadowing to sort of draw the reader into the story?
Sure. It's really a lesson I learned from teaching. I spent a long time teaching history classes and teaching big freshman classes, 100 kids in the room. And what you have to do if you want to hook a room like that is you have to tell a compelling story. You gotta say, if you get up in front of a room of 118-year-olds and you start talking about, this is what this historian argues, and this is what this historian argues, which is what historians tend to do when they write, half of them are asleep within 5 minutes and the other half are never coming back. But if you can tell a compelling story, then you can hang a lot of historical analysis on it. So that was kind of the main motivation for writing it the way I did. Everything is true. I'm not making up a quote from anyone. Anyone who said anything in there, I have documentation that they said it. This is not a work of fiction. This is explicitly nonfiction, and I like to think rigorously nonfiction, but I wanted to tell it in a way that people would actually, and I'm not claiming I did this. You guys can, in the reading group, can tell me differently, though I'd appreciate it if you didn't. I tried to write it in a way that people wanted to read, that people who weren't other historians wanted to read. And I'll give you one really specific example of this. Somewhere in the screen here, I think are my relatives, Mary and Don Scheibel. And they will appreciate this more than anybody else. I wanted to write a book my father would read. My dad, who has passed on, but my dad was a voracious reader. He loved reading books, but he was also not, but he didn't have a college education. He went to high school and then he went out and got a job. And if I handed him an academic book, he would get stuck with it. He'd get so far, he'd get within the first 20 pages or so, and he these barriers go up. It was hard for him to want to plow through it. And I know that because the first book I wrote was an academic book. And when I finished it, I brought it home and I gave it to my parents. My parents are really nice people. They were, oh, we're so proud of you. We really love this. And then they put it up on the shelf in the living room. And every time I came home for like the next 10 years, it was on the shelf with the bookmark in it where they gave up. And it was really, really early. I didn't want to do that again. I wanted to be able to read, want to read past page 20. And so that's what I tried. I tried to write it in a way that my dad would want to read it. And what I would do is I would send him a chapter. I'd finish a chapter and I would send it to him and he would read it and he would get back to me and tell me, well, he actually always told me they were good because he really cared much more about my mental health than he cared at all about the book. So he was always praising me, which is also really cool if you can get someone to do that for you. But that was a long answer to say I was using these techniques because I wanted my dad to read this book.
Well, I can say mission accomplished because I loved it, and I am a person who sometimes struggles with nonfiction. So it was amazing. It has been on my list of books to read for a while, and I sometimes do get intimidated by nonfiction, and I'm so glad that I read Arc of Justice.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course.
See, this is that mental health thing,
See? Well, it's true. Kind of speaking of the sources that you use to kind of construct this, can you tell us a little bit about the kind of sources that you use to bring this story to life and put it together?
Sure. So there were a lot of print sources. I started out, the reason I knew I could write this book is I went to the NAACP's files. That was the first thing I did. And they were, they're on microfilm, which some of you may remember. And there was like 2 rolls of microfilm, which is a lot of documents, on the Sweet trial. And so I said, oh, there's enough to do this. So I started with the NAACP documents, and then I built it out from there. I followed Dr. Sweet around. I went down to Bartow, Florida, where he grew up, which was one of the great experiences of the trip. I went to Wilberforce, I went to Howard, and then Daniel Baxter sent me an email one day. I'd never met Daniel, I didn't know Daniel at all. He sent me an email one day and he said that he had grown up in the house and his mom and dad lived in the house and would I like to come see it? And I'm no idiot. I said, yes. So one Saturday morning, I went down to the house and they very graciously took me through the entire house and showed, somebody's house, and they were showing me all the rooms, and I went up to the front bedroom, and that was transformative. I mean, that was one of the most important things because it's one thing, and I hope Daniel will mention this, it's one thing to talk about them to write about them being in the house and seeing that mob out on the street. It's a whole nother thing to look out that front window and realize that if that mob had charged that house, they would have been on the front porch in 15 seconds?
Wow.
And you realize what that danger really was. And there's no way you get that except from Daniel's incredible generosity to me. So I built up a lot of documents. I did a lot of traveling around. I met a few people along the way, like Dr. Sweet's baby brother, who lived in Bartow and invited me in for an afternoon, which was another amazing experience. People were incredibly generous to me. The trial had a transcript, so that really helped. I had the police report from the night they were arrested, which is also a transcript. And somebody else from Detroit sent it to me. They had it in their basement. And They sent me a box full with the trial transcript. Arthur Beer down at the University of Detroit, now University of Detroit Mercy, he had it in his basement. People were incredibly generous, giving me access, giving me help. And it's all of those sources that end up in those giant footnotes that run at the back of the book.
That's incredible. Wow. This question is going to make me sound like a little bit of a pessimist, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you chose the title Arc of Justice? So, while the outcome of Dr. Sweet's case may reflect the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quote it comes from, housing discrimination existed legally for decades after this trial. And like you mentioned previously, Detroit remains one of the most segregated cities in the nation. So many of the outcomes that you discuss in Arc of Justice don't really reflect the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice.
I am really, really glad you asked me that, because that has bugged me for years, the title of the book. So here's the real story. As I was writing the book, as I was coming close to finishing the book, it had all sorts of titles. My editor and I, who was a wonderful, amazing editor, we kept changing the title of the book. And there was one bad title after another. And no, I will not tell you what any of them were because they were embarrassingly bad. We didn't have a title. And it turns out that books sort of need titles. And so we're getting close to having the book done and we still don't have a title. And I had given a talk at a university about the book, and I had used Arc of Justice as the title of that talk. And so in desperation, I kind of pulled it in and said, how about this? And we both agreed that it sounded very kind of majestic. Mm-hmm. The problem is that when I had used it in the talk, I used it as the very last line of the talk. And the very last line of the talk, what I said was that the arc of the moral universe is very, very long, but it does not always bend towards justice. And that's what I thought I was going to have as the last line of the book.
Okay.
Except that my wife, who is much, much smarter than me, who also read the whole thing, and at that point, admittedly, may have been also feeling like, would you finish the damn thing? She told me, no, you need the last line that the book has. And she was right. So the problem with the title is that, as you said, Amber, that it's an optimistic thought, right? And this is not an optimistic book. This is tragedy. It took me a long time to realize that too. I was writing tragedy. This is about people doing incredibly brave things, doing the right thing, and losing. Yeah. So the title's wrong. Giving a book a title is a bit like naming your children. That, you know, you spend all that time when you're expecting and you go over like 10 million names and you worry about them all. And then you name the child and you can't, like 3 months later, you can't imagine them ever having another name.
Sure.
That's kind of what this is like. I can't imagine it now having another name, but it's the wrong title in that, for the very reason you said. So at the very start of the book, very first thing you encounter, there's that quote about the arc of the moral universe, and I put below it a very short poem from Langston Hughes that is way darker.
Yeah.
And I put it there as a substitute for that last line that I wanted, probably the only person in the world who realized what that meant. But that's why I put it there, because this is in fact not about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. I will say, I feel obligated to say for myself, I do believe that it will bend towards justice, but this is not that story.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, thank you. That helps me understand. And I will say that the Langston Hughes poem did help me kind of realize, like, oh, this is what I'm getting into. This is not I don't think this is going to necessarily have a happy ending, because I didn't necessarily know, and I didn't want to do too much research before I started reading, because I wanted to just read it eyes wide open. And I think it accomplished that. So
I will also add, though this is a complete aside, that all of the chapter titles are fragments of Harlem Renaissance poetry. So sometimes it's a word, but that is, and again, that I'm telling you guys, so you now know, but I think that's pretty much all the people who know that. Yeah, I spent enormous amounts of time trying to find even a word sometimes from a Harlem Renaissance poem, because I got it in my head to do that. So there's also a through line that's I'm the only person who realizes that is tied with Harlem Renaissance poetry.
Very cool. Very cool. I know that we're kind of to keep us on our schedule. I'm gonna turn it over to my colleague Joel in just a minute, but I just had one or two questions for you. We are getting many reader questions, really great ones that I'm excited to ask you at the end of today's discussion. But this is kind of a doozy, but maybe there are one or two things that come immediate to mind. What do you think were the most important impacts of this trial and its outcome on Detroit and maybe the nation?
I think that's the tragedy. That, it's a remarkable thing that, if you all haven't finished, you can mute me now, that Darrow wins this trial, but it does not change the system of segregation. It doesn't stop the system of segregation. The housing segregation in the United States and Detroit becomes more and more entrenched. And that's the central tragedy of this story, that there is, again, this act of real defiance, of incredible courage that does not transform the system. In fact, it doesn't slow it down at all. And that's what makes this a tragedy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What are you working on now?
I'm trying to finish a history. It's really close. In fact, I've been getting myself all morning. I spent the entire morning thinking about White Flight, which is really a fun way to spend your morning. It's a history of it's a revisiting a new history of the 1960s.
Very neat.
That has raised, it has to obviously, very much at the center of it.
Very neat. Well, thank you so much. I will return to ask some additional reader submitted questions at the end of today's program. But right now, I would like to kind of pass the microphone over to my colleague Joel Kurth, who's the managing editor of Bridge, Michigan.
Well, I just want to add my kudos to, I know that journalists aren't supposed to be fanboys, but I think this is a really great experience for us to all see, just not to only talk about the book, but to see where it happens. And I will say that the book came out, I thought, at really opportune time, because I was a reporter, and it came out right before the housing market collapse in Detroit, which also followed along very predictable lines that have been drawn years ago. And I know Dan Baxter, who's an assistant executive with Wayne County for some time. I didn't know until last year that he grew up in the house, and it's an amazing experience that we're going to have now. I think if everyone can turn to speaker view, I think Dan is going to be generous enough to sort of show us the rooms where it happened and kind of walk us through the house. Hi, Dan.
Hey, what's happening, Joel?
Good, how you doing?
I'm
Good.
very well. I'm very
Great.
well.
So I didn't know. So can you talk about your experience with the house? You grew up in the house. Did you always know that it had this important part of history?
Yeah, so first let me just say thank you so much for the opportunity to sit in on this session. It is definitely a delight. It's always good to see one of my main men, Kevin Boyle, who is just such a great writer and a great person. And I'm looking forward to seeing him again sometime early next month. I think it's September the 9th. We'll be doing some stuff. So once again, thank you so much. And yes, so my parents bought the house in 1958. And that's a great story. One day I'll have an opportunity to kind of share that with you. Then I was born in 65, right here at 2905 Garland. Living in the house was probably the same experience that most kids have in living in a house. I mean, you get up every morning, you have breakfast, you do your normal routine. And that's what I did. There wasn't nothing special until probably 1975. And that's when a news reporter came to the house to do an interview. He wanted to interview with my dad, but my dad didn't want to talk to the press that day for a number of reasons. And my mother was adamant. She said, Herbert, somebody has to talk to this man about the house. So my dad said, well, let Danny do it. Now, I'm 10 years old, mind you. So I go outside, I sit on the brick wall, which is the fence, and the reporter asks me a question. He says to me, do you know the history of this house? And I had a little knowledge of it, and the only thing I really knew was that, and I told him that a black guy used to live here a long time ago. He killed a white guy and he didn't go to jail. That's what I knew. He looked at me, he asked me a couple more questions. He wrote those down on a notepad, he took a picture and he left. That following Monday, when I get to school, my teacher, I was in the 5th grade, she says, hey, everybody, we have a celebrity in the house. So I'm looking around for Michael Jackson, Rodney Allen Rigby, or somebody special, right? Donny Osmond, anybody, you know. And then she stands before the class and she opens up this newspaper and there's an article. And it says, little has changed since the 25 trials. And in the middle of the article was the picture of me that the newspaper man had taken that previous week. So my teacher, she read the story, and of course it was about Dr. Sweet and some of his trials, and did a comparative analysis to what was going on in 1975. And afterwards, she says to me, come on, Danny, stand before the class and answer some questions. So I got all of these kids raising their hands, asking these questions, and I didn't have an answer for anything. That day when I went home, I told my mother what happened, and she was so excited. She went into the pantry, and she got this briefcase that was loaded with all of these clippings and articles about the man who had moved in the house in 1925, on September 8th, 1925. So at that time, I became absorbed in the story of Dr. Osean Sweet and what he did. And very much like Kevin, the only thing you really knew at that time was just the surface information. He moved in 1925. He faced a mob. Leon Bryner was killed. The police arrest everybody, charge them with murder. In steps Clarence Darrow, 2 trials later. One was acquitted, he was not guilty. Henry was not guilty. And that was basically the story. I mean, you had, I think the guy, Weiner, had wrote the book, A Man's Home, a Castle. But again, it wasn't very extensive or in depth, but it was information. So, you know, as a kid growing up, you know, every now and then you'd have somebody from Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, the Michigan Chronicle would stop by. Some folk from Hollywood would stop by, take pictures, talking about doing a movie, but it never came to pass. So it was just a basic life outside of those particulars associated with Dr. Sweet. And then things started moving fast back in 2005 when Kevin wrote his book. Another book was written about the case, and then interest began to be drawn. That year, Mayor Mike Duggan was the prosecuting attorney at the time, and the National Black Attorneys Association was coming into Detroit to have their national convention. And that's when we started working towards getting historical designation and markers. So we were able to get the national marker from the National Park Service. We were able to get the state of Michigan marker, as well as started pushing the city of Detroit to get the house designated as a historical landmark for the city. So we were able to do that with the assistance of Mike Duggan. And then in 2015, something phenomenal happened. On Good Friday, I met with the mayor, the city clerk, concerning the 2016, I'm sorry. We had the forthcoming presidential election. And in that conversation, or at the end of the conversation, the mayor says to me, "Hey, Dan, your parents still own that house?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Let's get together and try to create some opportunities where we can raise some money to restore the home." And sure enough, a couple of years later, with the assistance of Dr. Boyle, we had the opportunity to receive a $500,000 grant from the National Park Service to restore the home.
Wow.
So that's where we are right now. That work is going to start this fall. We have an additional opportunity where we're going to be able to create the Dr. Osean Suite Historical Park, which will encompass the properties across the street and the two properties next door to the house. One will be the annex, as well as the next one will be the parking lot for those individuals who would like to come and tour the home.
When it's done, what do you expect do you have a timeline, and what do you expect the experience will show? What will the museum entail?
Well, I think the museum, the timeline will probably be about 2 or 3 years to get everything in place and all of the work done. The hope is to open the house up as a museum where people will have an opportunity to really stand in the space that Dr. Sweet defended his right to protect his home. I think that when people come in, and I've opened the house up on several occasions, and everyone is just kind of floored in terms of how we've done some of the work. Just so that you know, my mother passed in 2018. She left the house to me. And what I had to do during that time was I had to kind of move 60 years worth of living outside of the house to open it up, to start doing some of the work. So we did that. I hired a local artist who did some graphic work on some of the furniture that have quotes, like a quote that says, "When I opened the door and I saw the mob, I realized I was facing the same mob that had hounded my people throughout this history." Those quotes and pictures of different folks who played a role in that particular case are throughout the entire house. So what we're working to do is create imagery so that when folk have an opportunity to come in, they don't just see an old house that smells like old furniture, that looks like a historical home, but there's an expression that speaks to people, that gives them an in-depth understanding of what happened at this house on September 8th and 9th of 1925.
Can you give us a peek?
Yeah, sure. Let me just flip things around. Okay. This works. Okay, cool. Okay. Okay, good. There it is. All right. 1 second. All right. So we're in, is that better for everybody?
Yeah.
Right now, I'm in the living room. Here we have the living room. And as I mentioned, some of the artwork that was done by some of the artists. Right here on the fireplace, there is a photo with Mayor Duggan where we did the announcement on August 13, 2018, concerning the award, the grant money, the $500,000 for restoring the house. I purchased one of these things, a Victrola, because, I mean, that's interpretive. I don't know whether or not Dr. Sweet had one, but this one was made in 1925. Here's the dining room.
Is that the original cabinet?
Yep, this is the original, and what we called it was the cabinet in the wall, right? Yep, this is the original cabinet. One of the conversations I had with my mom is, I said, Mom, I said, why in the world would you have painted all of the wood, all of this beautiful wood? Why would you do that? I had a long, extensive conversation with her about it, and she just listened to me rant on. And after I finished ranting, she said, Danny, this is my house, and I did with it what I wanted to. I didn't like that wood. Now, when I'm gone and it's yours, you do what you want to do with it. So the hope here is to begin the restoration work in the living room and dining room so that we make sure that it looks like it did in 1925. And it's not going to be that difficult, because what my parents did was they actually painted over the wallpaper. So we're able to kind of get chips and bits and pieces of that wallpaper, and then we can recreate and remake that. And these photos, this is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the editor of the Crisis magazine at the time. This here is Thurgood Marshall. And the reason why he's here, certainly he wasn't involved in the case, but his future was inextricably connected to it, because the legal defense fund that the NAACP established during the Sweet trial was the same legal defense fund that Thurgood Marshall used to try the case Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. All right. So this is the bathroom. I redid this. It was 1970s style, so we kind of stripped all of the wallpaper, the paneling, and kind of turned it back to the 1920s as best as we possibly could. And this is the den. I would think that it was called a parlor at the time. There's a photo of Dr. Sweet, Clarence Darrow. Quote, I have to die a man or live as a coward. Here's a 1920s radio. Here's another interpretive work, I Am a Man, and it says, I have to die a man or live as a coward. All right. Here's the front door. This is the door when he said, when I opened the door and I saw the mob, I realized I was facing the same mob that had hounded my people throughout its entire history. In my mind, I was pretty confident of what I was up against. I had my back against the wall. I was filled with a peculiar fear, the fear of one who knows the history of my race. I know what mobs had done to my people before. So that's that intersection where that mob was. Here's the kitchen, the 70s style kitchen. This is where Gladys was cooking dinner that day. This is the side room. We kind of transformed this into an office. And then there's Langston Hughes' poem, Harlem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred. So this is we're going upstairs now. This is my bedroom. I grew up as a kid. This is where I slept.
How big is the house, Dan?
Oh, it's about 2,500 square feet. Here's the bathroom. Still a lot of work to be done. Another room. And here's the room where it happened. Here's the bedroom. That's a picture of my mom and dad. So here's that window where the rock came in. And again, there's the intersection. As a kid, I used to spend a lot of time, after I found out about Dr. Sweet, I spent a lot of time looking out that window, trying to imagine what that mob looked like. And no matter how hard I imagined, there was no way that I could ever feel that peculiar fear that he was feeling that day because of what he had done. The one thing that I always tell people is that while his life came to a tragic end, do you want me to spend some more time in here, Joe?
I think in the interest of time, I think that's good unless Amber has any other ideas.
No, I think
Okay.
that's great.
No, it's wonderful. It's
Okay.
amazing how it's a much more narrow room than I thought it was. You can really sort of feel the walls closing in, or imagine how the walls are closing in.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know what? As a kid, I thought this room was huge until I started doing the work in the house. I said, this room is really small.
But you were smaller then.
Yeah, that's right. You're absolutely correct. Yep.
That is amazing, Dan. If people want to help,
This is this is important. This is where they found the guns. Yeah. That's really important. This is the linen closet.
how
Sure.
can readers help make the museum a reality?
So what we will be doing, the house is going to be placed in a foundation, the Osean Suite Foundation on Urban Diversity. And after September 9th, on September 9th, the City of Detroit and the Osean Suite Foundation is going to announce the work that we're going to be to open it up so that it's a museum, so that more people can come in and have an opportunity to experience the moment. On that day, Dr. Boyle will be there, Mayor Duggan, some of our local elected officials, and some other folk will be there to do presentations to talk about how important the work here is in terms of our history, and recognizing and understanding that it's a roadmap to today. So
I think we're losing Dan.
Dan, are you still there?
you lost me?
You're
Briefly.
back.
I'm here.
Back.
Can you see me?
We can see you
Yes.
now.
All right,
You're
good.
good. You must have
All
been moving too fast.
Maybe so.
Well, that was amazing. That was incredible. Before I turn it back to Amber, is there any consensus? I'm sure most people, when they're reading it, Ocean or Osean? Is that like potato, potato?
So the family, some people call them Osean. Some people pronounce it Osean, and Ocean. But the family prefers Osean.
Okay. Very well. Good. Well, thank you so much. That was terrific.
Okay.
That was
You're
incredible.
welcome. You're welcome. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Very, very neat. So I have a handful, actually I have more than a handful. I have more questions than we're going to possibly have time for the two of you from our readers, but some really good ones that came across so far. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. This first one is actually for you, Dan. This comes from a reader named Jan Carr, who wondered if you could speak a little bit about sort of the way the neighborhood changed over the years. She said she had family that lived on Hastings during the 60s and 70s, when the neighborhood was sort of transitioning from this kind of white working class neighborhood to more families of color. Can you talk a little bit about how the neighborhood changed over the years?
So I'll answer that from my father's perspective. When my parents purchased the home in 1958, they were the third African-American family to live on this block. My dad explained to me that the second day that he moved in, two of the families across the street came to him and tried to sell their home to him for $2,000 a piece. He couldn't afford it because he had just bought this house for $15,000 and put $500 down on the land contract. However, he mentioned that every morning there was a new Black family that had moved in. So at nighttime, the white families would move out and Black families would move in. By the time I came of age, in the 1970s, there were very few whites who lived in the community, with the exception of those folk who lived in Indian Village. But everything probably east of Indian Village all the way to maybe St. Jean or as far reaching to Connor, probably represented about 85% African Americans. I think the last white family who lived in the block between Gothi and Mack, they left out like in the 1979, 1980.
Okay.
So right now it's predominantly African American.
Okay, thank you. This next question is it really can be for both of you. I'm curious to know whether anyone has approached either of you about sort of, particularly when it comes to a screenplay, maybe turning Arc of Justice into a screenplay. This reader said it seems like it has such rich, characters and people and atmosphere that would make it a really timely story. Have either of you been approached in that way?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
It came close. Well, once it came very, very close. And then oddly enough the deal was undone by that most unlikely of sources, the Chinese Communist Party. So it actually was even cast. The movie was cast and they had a schedule to go with it. And then the Chinese, for some reason, I forget, decided that they wanted to pull all investment from Chinese investment from the movie industry. And so the company that had put up some ridiculous amount of money pulled it out. And that was that. It was about 3-4 years ago.
Yeah, I read about that. Sure
Very
did.
interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, some folk have approached me as this summer, in fact, to talk to me about writing a script. However, the conversation kind of fell off probably within the last month or so. But yes, there has been conversation as well.
Very interesting. Well, I'd watch if it ever comes about.
And if any of you in the book group have connections with the Chinese Communist Party, if you could just kind of put in a good word, that would be great.
Excellent. Excellent. You can drop us a note in the chat, please.
That's right.
These are two kind of writing process questions for you, Dr. Boyle. One reader, actually a few readers, wanted to know how long your writing and research process took. And also another reader wanted to know, now that the book has been out for some time, if there's anything you would add to a revised edition of the book if it were to be reissued.
That's a great question. So let me think. It was It was actually a quick process. It was about 6-7 years start to finish. The writing itself was about 2.5 years, and the research was most that. I had a full-time job teaching at the same time. The thing that for me, the thing that I did, I wish I could have done, I just couldn't, are two things really. Gladys Sweet is really important to this story, and I just couldn't get enough information to kind of make her as big a figure as she should be. I think she was really critical. Really, I think the house was more hers than his. She really wanted this house. She was a Detroiter. She grew up about a mile from the house in an all-white neighborhood, actually. She was African-American, but the neighborhood was all white. I just couldn't get enough information. I don't know if I could get it now, but I wish I could have done that. And I did feel like I wanted to write a little bit more. It's not their story, obviously, about the Briner family, the man who was killed. And I did, in fact, meet his family after the book was published. They contacted me and said that they wanted to talk, and I met them. They live in suburban DC. And so that story I could have filled out more, if there were another edition. So I'd say those are the two things that I wish I could have done more, was those two things.
Well, very good. I'm keeping an eye on the time because we're just so appreciative of the two of you, and also to all of our readers for taking part today. So I think I'm going to end it there, even though there were many, many more good questions that our readers had. But I just want to say to you, Kevin, and to you, Dan, thank you so much for taking an hour of your time to do this, and for sharing your stories, for sharing your work. We're just so grateful for it. It has meant a lot to us. So thank you for taking this afternoon to talk with us about Arc of Justice and about your childhood in the home, man. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. A couple of closing notes before we sign off. Thank you to Bridge Readers for participating today, to my colleagues Joel and Catherine for making this discussion a great one. Just a reminder that we will be posting the recording of this conversation in Bridge tomorrow. And I also, for those of you who stayed to the very end here, wanted to announce October's Bridge Book Club selection, which will be The Women of the Copper Country by Mary Doria Russell. The author will be joining us for that discussion, which will be the last week of October. For those who aren't familiar with this book, this one is a novel. It's a historical novel about a woman named Annie Clements, who was a courageous woman who started a rebellion by leading a strike against the largest copper mining company in the world. It is a novel, but based on historical events, set in Calumet in the UP. So watch Bridge for an announcement post about the book. And Bridge Club members, keep your eye on your email inbox for details about how to get a free copy of the book. I see that it is 1 o'clock. So with that, I want to wish you all a wonderful day, and thank you so much for taking part in today's Bridge Book Club. Have a great day. Bye.